The Big Six in the Premier League is one of the most controversial statements these days, with arguably the Prem more competitive than ever. And of course, with 33% of this so-called Big Six currently in the bottom five of the Premier League. Today, we're getting into it. We're going to have that debate. Should we just simply scrap this ridiculous Big Six narrative, or is it right and should it continue? Let's kick things off, Reese, before we even get into it. It's in the thumbnail. Man United and Spurs, two of this so-called teams on a pedestal, the Big Six, are 16th and 17th in the Premier League table, an absolute disgrace, directly above the Premier League relegation zone. Let's start there. Do we like this term Big Six? And in the context of what we're seeing right now, what are we what are we thinking on Man United and Spurs at the minute?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to argue if you're calling yourself a top six side and you are currently above the relegation zone, and you're probably only really there because the three promoted teams have been so bad, you have to question it. However, one season, it's not really much to judge. Consistent seasons is whether you fall out of it or not. However, we can't escape the fact that the top six are called the top six because they're the financial juggernauts of this league. Without those top six, there is no Premier League or appeal of Premier League. As much as people don't want to admit that, look, I'm critical of the competitiveness of this league and the fairness of this league, but they are it's the glue, probably the right term. They are. Man United and Spurs have had horror seasons. Worse, particularly for Man United, than what they've had. Spurs, even if they struggled, they were still around the top 10. Even if we look at their Premier League history as a whole, they were often that solid top 10 side. It's been a shocker, and it's actually made it quite laughable for that aspect of saying, how can you call yourself a top six side if you're struggling? But it happens to every team. Every team has a bad season or two. United, you could argue, bad 10, but they finished in the top four a few of those times. So,
Yeah, I think that's the point. I mean, a lot of this term has been around revenue as well as trophies, but then you analyze the likes of, as I said, Man United, who we know with that revenue juggernaut for so long, arguably the biggest brand or club in the world at one point. And you then look at Spurs and go, well, hold up, Spurs haven't won a trophy since 2008. Um, how can you on what basis are Spurs a big club? Do you know what I mean? And that I think is for many people is the debate. It's not just about this season them being in 17th place, which is absolutely inexcusable, of course, but it's just such a tough one to justify because when you look at every other metric, no trophies, no real success. How can you call this team a big six?
I think that's a little harsh. They are a massive club. You might say, well, they've only got two top division titles, but they are the only team to have won the FA Cup being in non-league. They were the first English team, if I'm not mistaken, to do the double. Um, they've had a history of signing big names, Klinsmann, Gascoigne over the years. They've been consistently collecting trophies for the Premier League. Um, it's not very fair to say they're not the top six. They've got the fan base. They've done very, very well. It's just unfortunately it's maybe not been as the momentum hasn't continued into the Premier League era, but they haven't always been there. But then you could argue, what about Aston Villa? You could argue, what about Wolves? They won trophies under Stan Cullis. What about Leeds? Under Don Revie or Brian Clough under Forest. But all those teams have tailed off. Spurs have always been there, even if they've not won anything. They've been semi-finals, finals. Being a London club helps. The London bias does help, but they still are a top six side.
Yeah, I think as well, the question I want to ask, and it's definitely one for people to put their thoughts in the comments. At what point does this narrative change? Not, we're not saying scrap it altogether, but we've seen it evolve over the years, and we'll get into the history in a minute. But we've seen it evolve. So, at what point, what needs to happen for either a new club to enter this, or for a new narrative? What needs to change? Because I feel like it's been top six for a while now, at least kind of 10 years. Yeah, at the very least.
Yeah, it'll evolve. Before we go into the history side of it, it will evolve if Spurs, they obviously won't, and Man United obviously won't, especially because Man United's history in general. But if they stay out of the top four, and linger around top six, they'll still be in that category. If they fall out of it completely for a few years and say a Newcastle or Aston Villa consistently compete in that top six, it might be Spurs that fall away, but I don't think it will be because I think Spurs will bounce straight back. But it has to be a consistent thing. However, as we've seen, it's not been a consistent changing that. It's changing the number of what they consider top. We've gone to
Yeah.
top six. We're now edging into a top seven, potentially a top eight. With this new Champions League place awarded, obviously we've got five places. I think it's going to be trickling down to more until we probably have a top 20.
I think, well, that's kind of the point I'm going with. So you look now, and the Prem, arguably, in some ways, is more competitive than ever before. Maybe the relegation sides and those clubs who keep yo-yoing between the leagues will disagree with that, but particularly now, you look at even the Champions League race this season, and that kind of mid-table, mid to upper table bracket genuinely does feel more competitive than ever. So, at what point do you say, right, well, actually, Villa now got Champions League football, currently in sixth place, going to get European football again? At what point do they then become part of this big six narrative? And you'll get to a point where, as you said, it's a top 10. Half the teams are considered top, which just kind of devalues the entire statement altogether and the point of it.
Well, it falls into that category of how the European game is involved. Again, before I dip into that history for you and test your ball knowledge, Jordan, we I assume the Champions League will only expand. It's the Super Bowl of football in particularly in Europe. It will only expand. It will only allow for teams like Villa, Newcastle, etc., to guarantee those slots every year. And that's when we'll see an expansion of those of what we call a top seven, top eight, top nine. That's the way it's going to go. Because more places have to be given to English teams in that case if the league expands. Whether you agree with that or not, that will be the case because again, there you've got the economic powerhouse to them and the coefficient ranking. That's when it will change. At the moment, it's four. With the coefficient, we've got five. Whether we get five again, I don't know. That's when, again, we've got a top six category where they're the teams fighting for those top four. You expect more to be involved because realistically, it's only fourth place that's worth watching in the Premier League. Really, the relegation sides have not been great. You can only really win the Premier League if you're one or two teams. It's the fourth spot that's the most entertaining. So the league might capitalize on that and expand that to make that worthwhile.
Yeah, and let's touch on the kind of history of this term. So, from my understanding, this was kind of it was first the Big Five back in the 1980s. That's kind of where it comes from in my head. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think at the time, Everton were in that mix as well. So that does show when you go back to the origins of this kind of term that there is multiple clubs that come in and out of this so-called Big Five, big six. Big two. It kind of was at one point with Arsenal United. So it can change, but I'm still questioning over what qualifies for that ever to be changed. I feel like it's so ingrained in people's minds who and what clubs that involves. I don't see how it changes.
It will always change. If you look at football at the start of the 20th century, you got your Blackburns, you got your Prestons, you got your Notts Counties around there, your Sheffield Wednesdays, you got your, you know, Man United didn't win it, had only won one FA Cup, I think it was before Matt Busby took charge. So those were the big guns. Obviously, money plows into the cities. The city teams become more popular. Excuse me, Aston Villa, they've won trophies, but they've not won them in a consistent spell. It's been two or three and then nothing for a few years. When football was, you could argue, much more competitive, you had Leeds have their moments. You had obviously Spurs were always there, Arsenal were always there, United were there. United also got relegated in the 70s, let's not forget. Chelsea flirted with Division 2, Division 1, every now and then. You got those different teams had won the competition, like we said about, say, FA Cup. In 30 years before, was it in the 30 years before the FA Cup, before the Premier League, 15 different teams had won it. But the top five were the teams that were arguably the biggest at the time. So the foundation of the Premier League was driven to get more money. It's basically a Super League, folks. You need to understand that. Arsenal, Spurs, Man U, Liverpool, Everton. Chelsea not in that conversation. Manchester City not in that conversation. Leeds not in that conversation. Aston Villa, who finished second in the first Premier League season, were not in that conversation. They were the top five. Only the team that won the league qualified for the Champions League, hence the name Champions League. Man United did that consistently. And then it become the top two, which was, if I'm not mistaken, in 96, 97. Newcastle falling into that category. Newcastle were never considered top four side, probably. Well, they actually were at the time because they often competed in there. Then England got given three positions, so you could argue it become a top three, I suppose, and that wasn't until 98, 99. That's when Arsenal and United fought over it quite a lot, and I think it was the winner, probably the winner of the FA Cup, got it as well. If to correct my knowledge, if not, it was third place anyway. Then it become four in 2000 and officially become four in 2001, 2002. That's when the top four theory comes about. Again, Chelsea were not in that conversation, neither were Man City. It was Arsenal, Liverpool, Man U, and Newcastle very consistently. Then you had Leeds pushing for it. Spurs obviously had their moments as well. Sunderland and Ipswich even flirted with it at one stage. Then, of course, Chelsea got their investment. Man City got their investment. Those four sides become known as the Big Four. We don't use the term top four anymore, do we?
No, only in context of Champions League, and now it's going to change to top five anyway. So it's interesting to see that development over time, actually. And I guess let's touch on the European point. I know we said it at the start of the episode about the fact that whichever way you spin it, where Man United are right now and where Spurs are in the league, obviously the fact they've both got to the Europa League final means that one of these teams one of these big six teams, and maybe this proves the point all along, right? That the fact that one of these teams, regardless of having a terrible season, is still going to end up with Champions League football. You can probably come out both ways on this as to whether it is an absolute disgrace and embarrassment, and whether they shouldn't be given a UCL spot because it is, for finishing that low in the table. So we'll touch on Wenger's comments because that was kind of what he came out and said. And to be honest, a lot of fans are kind of in agreement that it is an absolute disgrace that the 16th or 17th place team in the Premier League is going to get Champions League football, the pinnacle of football. Where do you stand on Wenger's comments?
I always have the utmost time and respect for Arsene Wenger. His impact on the game can't be ignored. Some of his ideas are also very smart. You could argue that it was him that's led to the game we've got today. I do disagree with him though. I think it's unfair because I mean you're qualifying for a Champions League and only one team is the champion anyway. So it kind of devalues it as it is. Wenger, of course, consistently finished fourth to qualify for it, and you could argue, isn't that a bit of a joke in its own? I like the idea. It gives an incentive to win the Europa League, and with teams not dropping into it anymore, it increases those chances a little bit more for some teams. And for Spurs United, it's a good opportunity for them to do it. You know, is it acceptable that, say, Chelsea won the Champions League when they finished seventh or sixth? It's that same argument. If Ipswich were in the Europa League and got relegated and somehow qualified and won the Europa League, would we all be saying it's an amazing achievement? We probably would. So we can't just decide to change the narrative to it suits us because we all like an underdog story. The reality is that's the incentive. It encourages teams to get back into it. It encourages teams you might not expect to get back into it as well. Um, Spurs and United can compensate for a shoddy season. And the reality is the team that's finished second or likely to finish second this year have won absolutely nothing. And they've won something and got themselves into the competition. So who's had a better season?
Yeah, we'll have to save that debate, I think, for another episode because you're right. There is a debate to be had that winning a major European trophy and finishing qualifying for the Champions League is a better season than coming second or third and winning nothing. That's the crazy thing. That's where we're at. Um, but when you compare, obviously Arsenal are the team we're probably speaking about, but when you compare Arsenal and Spurs this season, it's been night and day. But it is absolutely mental that Spurs could end up with a theoretically better finish. But yeah, maybe that's a debate for another episode. Um, I guess the next question to ask really is if we were going to redesign this top six right now, is there any changes that you'd make? And I'll kick things off because there's only kind of one I've got in my mind. And I do think the Liverpools, the Arsenals, the Cities, the Chelseas, and to be honest, I still do think Man United, I think have still earned or still justified their place in that top six. If we're going to say we still want them, we want to hear that term still. Many people would say absolutely not. Let's just scrap the term altogether. But so for me, those five teams, I think, even United, I know they've been bad for a decade, but they've still gone and won FA Cups. They still go and win, Europa League. So for me, that is still proving who they are. Um, so for me, it's got to be Tottenham, right? For all the reasons I said already, 17th in the Prem table, not won a trophy as we know for, you know, 20 odd years almost. And yeah, other than £1 billion stadium and a rich owner, not much to go off. So I probably personally would throw maybe a Newcastle in the mix instead, particularly considering the ownership and now they've got a bit more financial power. Um, so that would probably be my only change. But again, open for debate because you can argue, well, Newcastle have only just won a Carabao Cup, and Spurs could then go and win the Europa League. So it's like I don't know. It's a really tough conversation actually. What
There are
what?
layers. There are a
Yeah,
lot of layers to this. Um, no one's right, no one's wrong. That's the important thing to understand. My argument to this is the top six, the teams that are currently classed as the top six, does not change. Um, the reality is it might change over time because obviously these are the teams that have the history. They've got the pulling power. They've got the revenue. Of course, for three of those teams being based in London, that certainly helps. Um, they've got the history. You can argue, you can talk about Chelsea and City all you want, but they've got the trophies to go with it. If say Arsenal don't win anything for the next 30 years, but Villa win a few more trophies and finish in the top four a few more times, maybe you could argue that change. But the reality is the history at this moment in time helps them. You say about United being poor for the last 10 years, but they've got the probably the biggest fan base globally in England, in this league. And they're what the media outlets still talk about. Their downfall, United, United, United. They can't be out of that conversation. It's been nice to see Liverpool winning trophies again because even then they were still considered top four when they weren't very good. They weren't that much better. Um, so it stays the same for me. These are the clubs with the pulling power. Without these top six clubs, the Premier League does not have that appeal. Newcastle doesn't generate as much revenue as Spurs do. Yes, Newcastle have had a more successful time, but even when you think about it, how many people are tuning in to watch Newcastle? How many tourists are flying to Newcastle to watch them play? Same with Aston Villa. Even I mean, you could even argue at Manchester. How many other than Man United? I went on a tour of Anfield. Anfield was packed. Goodison Park was not. That's
yeah,
not disrespecting Everton because their history is so good and so unique. I love Everton, but it's just is what it is, you know. And that's how I see it. Is those top six teams are those top six sides for a reason. These are the teams that tried to join the Super League for a reason because they are the ones that put the bums on the seats, whether people want to admit that or not.
yeah. I think that's a really good point actually. And I guess to conclude, we'll obviously both have our sales on what we actually think should happen with this so-called term, but I think that's what it comes down to. Whether or not I think the term should just be scrapped altogether and it shouldn't be, I still do think it should be used because it does highlight the power in the Premier League and not in a way that other clubs can't get it. Because for me, I'd have that term like it has been over the last 20, 30 years, have that six teams constantly evolve. If Chelsea drop off for the next 5, 10 years, put in a Newcastle or a Villa who are winning trophies. Same with Spurs, as I've just said, or United. If they go on a drought, I know it's not an official like ranking or official term. It's a bit colloquial, but I think at the end of the day, that for me is how the term should evolve. Because you're right, that is the ultimate appeal. They are the teams in theory putting the bums on the seats, making the Prem worth watching.
It has to evolve. Imagine if the Premier League formed in 1980. Nottingham Forest had won back-to-back European Cups. There'd be that team, that are there. they've got an amazing history, Nottingham Forest, and of course they've surprised a few people this season, but they would have been that team. It's like the explosion of the TV rights and the Premier League because it's been so expertly marketed, so expertly driven. The teams that may not necessarily deserve the term were there at the right time.
Mm.
It's just as simple as that. If a new thing comes along in 20 years, those teams that are probably there will be that crux of the conversation.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that is all we've got time for this episode. As always, want to hear from you. Hit us up in the comments. Do you like the term? Do you think different teams should be in the top six? Or are you sick of hearing it and you just want it scrapped all together? As always, like, comment, and subscribe. You know the drill.